For millions of years, Earth was a silent laboratory. Continents drifted slowly, climates changed without asking permission, and ecosystems transformed again and again. In that ancient world, long before any civilization, something began to change in Africa. And this is important to understand. Human history did not begin with a sudden appearance. It began with slow, almost invisible transformations. In Eastern Africa, more than 4 million years ago, dense forests began to fragment. Jungles retreated, and savannas started to dominate the landscape. For many species, this was a catastrophe. For others, it was an opportunity. This is where a creature appears that was not an ape, but was not a human either. A form of life that walked between two worlds. Its name was Australopithecus. Let us pause here for a moment. Because Australopithecus was not a simple, primitive ancestor. It was, in fact, one of the first great experiments of human evolution. It was not strong, it was not particularly fast, and its brain was small, comparable to that of a modern chimpanzee. And yet, it possessed a characteristic that would change the course of everything that came afterward. Australopithecus began to walk upright, not perfectly or constantly, but enough to make a profound difference. And we are not talking about a minor detail. Walking on two legs freed the hands, changed body posture, and altered the way this creature observed its environment. For the first time, a hominin could look at the horizon differently, anticipate dangers, and travel long distances with less energy expenditure. One of the most revealing discoveries about this species occurred in 1974, when the remains of an ancient skeleton were found in Ethiopia. They called her Lucy. Lucy belonged to the species Australopithecus afarensis and lived more than 3 million years ago. Her skeleton revealed something surprising. Although her brain was small, her pelvis and legs confirmed that she walked upright. Here something decisive begins. Evolution did not wait for a large brain to begin the path toward humanity. First, it changed the body. Australopithecus still retained clearly ape-like traits. Its arms were long and strong, ideal for climbing trees, which indicates that it still depended on them for shelter and protection from predators. But at the same time, its legs were already adapted for bipedal walking. This combination reveals something fundamental. We are not looking at an incomplete form, but at a hybrid form, adapted to a world in transition. Although Australopithecus did not manufacture complex tools or master fire, there is evidence that it used objects from its environment intentionally. Stones, sticks, and other natural elements were employed as extensions of the body. And here it is, worth pausing again, because recognizing that an object can serve a purpose is the first step toward technology. The tool itself is not what matters. It is the idea behind its use. For nearly 1 million years, Australopithecus managed to survive in a hostile environment. It faced extreme climatic changes, formidable predators, and constant competition for resources. This tells us something crucial. Although it was neither the strongest nor the most intelligent, it was highly adaptable. And adaptability, more than strength or intelligence, is one of the main engines of evil. Now an inevitable question arises, and it is an uncomfortable one. Was Australopithecus human, or was it something different that simply disappeared? The answer is clear. Australopithecus is not our direct father. It is a branch of the evolutionary tree that flourished for a time and then went extinct. It did not reach us, but without its existence, our history would be impossible. And this is key to understand. Human evolution was not a straight line, nor an ascending ladder. It was a bush full of branches, of attempts, of paths that led nowhere. Australopithecus was one of those attempts, an imperfect draft, an experiment that proved that walking upright changed the destiny of a species. After Australopithecus, evolution could no longer turn back. The experiment had worked well enough to open new possibilities. Other species would appear later, with larger brains, more complex tools, and a different relationship with the world. But all of them would inherit something essential from this ancient hominin. The evolutionary decision to stand upright, because here, something decisive begins. With Australopithecus, Erd took the first step towards something completely new. The human being did not yet exist, but the path was already laid out. And from this point on, the history of humanity would no longer be the story of just another animal, but of species that were beginning, without knowing it, to ask who they were and where they were going. For a long time, it was believed that the origin of humanity began with an increase in brain size. That first we thought better, and then we changed the body. However, Australopithecus came to completely break that idea, and this is important to understand from the very beginning, because human evolution did not follow the path our modern intuition met. Australopithecus walked upright, used objects from its environment, and survived under difficult conditions, but its brain was small. Very small, barely a little larger than that of a modern chimpanzee. This raises a deep, almost uncomfortable question. How could a species with such a limited brain initiate the path toward being human? Let us pause here for a moment, because this detail changes the entire story. Brain size is not everything. What is truly decisive is not how large it is, but how it is used and what transformations it allows in the body and behavior. In the case of Australopithecus, evolution first bet on movement, not on complex thought. A large brain consumes an enormous amount of energy. In modern humans, it represents only about 2% of body weight, but consumes nearly 20% of total energy. For a species living in a hostile environment, with scarce and unpredictable food, a large brain would have been a disadvantage, not an advantage. We are not talking about a minor detail. Maintaining a large brain without a rich and constant diet would have been impossible. That is why evolution was cautious. It first modified the way of moving, posture, and interaction with the environment. Australopithecus did not need to plan long-term or create complex tools. Its survival depended on adapting quickly, moving between trees and savannas, and recognizing immediate dangers. A small but efficient brain was sufficient for that world. Here something decisive begins. Human evolution did not advance through abstract intelligence, but through practical solutions. Walking upright allowed longer distances to be traveled in search of food. Freeing the hands made it easier to carry offspring, food, or objects. Seeing above tall grass helped detect predators before being attacked. All of these advantages arose without the need for a large brain. In addition, the brain of Australopithecus, although small, already showed internal reorganizations. It was not just about size, but about structure. Some regions associated with motor control and coordination were beginning to develop differently from those of other primates. And this is key to understand. Evolution does not always add. Sometimes for hundreds of thousands of years, Australopithecus lived without developing complex language, without symbols, without culture as we understand it today. And yet, it survived. This forces us to rethink a deeply rooted idea. It was not advanced thinking that made us human at the beginning, but the ability to adapt bodily to a changing world. Let us pause here again, because this conclusion is uncomfortable for our modern view of the human being. We like to think we are special because of our intelligence, but history shows that we were first special because of our endurance, our ability to move, to wait, to persist. The brain came later. Over time, those bodily adaptations would create new evolutionary pressures. Walking long distances meant exploring wider territories. Exploring more meant remembering routes, recognizing patterns, anticipating seasons. Little by little, without haste, evolution would begin to favor slightly larger brains. But that was not yet happening with Australopithecus. That is why Australopithecus represents a unique stage. A species that was no longer an ape, but not yet human. A creature living in a precarious balance between two worlds, without knowing that its way of life was preparing the ground for something much greater. And this is important to say clearly. Without that small, functional brain, large brains would never have existed. Eventually, Australopithecus would disappear. Not because it was a mistake, but because evolution continued testing new paths. Other species would arise with larger brains, new abilities, and new challenges, but all of them inherited a fundamental lesson from this ancient hominin. You do not need to think like a human to begin becoming one, because here, something decisive begins. With Australopithecus, evolution learned that change does not always begin in the mind. Sometimes it begins in the feet, in the hands, in the way of looking at the world. And only later, much later, does the brain catch up. For millions of years, Australopithecus walked across Africa without knowing its time was limited. It was not a weak species, nor an evolutionary mistake. On the contrary, It was one of the most successful experiments in the early history of humanity. And yet, it disappeared. To understand why, we must abandon the idea that extinction always means failure. Let us pause here for a moment, because this part is often misunderstood. Australopithecus did not disappear overnight. It was not wiped out by a single catastrophe, nor by a war between species. Its disappearance was slow, silent, and deeply linked to changes in the world around it. Africa was not a stable environment. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the climate changed repeatedly. Forests contracted, savannas expanded, and resources became more unpredictable. Australopithecus had evolved for a mixed world, half trees, half open land, but that balance began to break down. And this is important to understand. When the environment changes faster than a species' ability to adapt, evolution shows no mercy. Australopithecus walked upright. Yes, but it still depended partially on trees. Its body was not fully adapted either to arboreal life or to open savanna life. That intermediate position, which had once been an advantage, began to turn into a disadvantage. At the same time, something decisive was happening. New species of hominins began to appear. Some of them already belonged to the genus Homo. They had slightly larger brains, greater planning ability, and a different relationship with the environment. We are not talking about a huge difference, but it was a crucial one. These new species began to manufacture more elaborate tools, make better use of resources, and move more efficiently. Compared to them, Australopithecus was not inferior, but it was less flexible. And in evolution, flexibility is everything. The strongest does not win. The one that adapts best to change does. Let us pause again here, because it is essential to understand that Australopithecus was not violently replaced. There is no clear evidence of direct extermination. What happened was more subtle. As new hominins occupied similar ecological niches, Australopithecus became trapped in an increasingly restricted space. In addition, its limited diet played a key role. It depended on foods that began to become scarce with climatic changes. Meanwhile, other species learned to consume a wider variety of resources, including meat, in a more systematic way. This provided more energy, which in turn made it possible to sustain larger brains. And here, something decisive begins. Energy and brain evolved together. Australopithecus did not make that leap. Not because it could not, but because its body and way of life were optimized for a different stage of the world. Evolution does not move backward or wait. It simply moves on. Over time, Australopithecus populations became smaller and more fragmented. Fewer individuals mean less genetic diversity. Less diversity means less capacity to adapt. And so, generation after generation, the species faded away without leaving a dramatic trace. But here's something crucial we must not forget. Australopithecus did not die without a legacy. Quite the opposite. Every step it took, every adaptation it developed, was inherited by those who came later. Its way of walking, its skeletal structure, its initial relationship with the environment. All of that still lives within us, because we are not talking about a species that failed. We are talking about a species that fulfilled its evolutionary role. Australopithecus was the bridge. Without it, the genus Homo would not have existed. Without its disappearance, our history would never have begun. And this is important to say clearly. Evolution has no mercy, but it also has no intention. Australopithecus disappeared, not because it was inferior, but because the world changed and others were better prepared for that new world. Thus ends the first great human experiment, not with a tragedy, but with a transition, a silent transition that opened the door to everything that would come afterward. Because here, something decisive begins with the disappearance of Australopithecus. The stage was set for the emergence of the true protagonist of our story, the human being. If you enjoyed this documentary, hibo sa like Ryan T. Bella, and subscribe to Rewrite Our History.